It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. I greatly appreciate that you are here, and I'm going to keep the introductory remarks relatively short this time because I am pushing this show out a little earlier than I might have normally done because in Central Florida, we have a hurricane coming. Milton is on his way and should hit us in the next day or so, maybe 2 days to get to Orlando. And I've been sharing a lot of content on social media. You can check that out on Facebook or Threads. A couple of basic things. Pretty powerful storm. It's going to be a powerful storm when it hits. Currently projected just south of Tampa Bay. And as it crosses the peninsula of Florida, it will likely go south of Orlando. I happen to live northwest of Orlando, so it's about as good a position as I can have anywhere in the Orlando area. But of course, it's all subject to change. If the storm tracks further north, for a while, it looked like the eye would go right over our house. But now it's a good 40 miles south of us. And for hurricanes that come from the Gulf of Mexico into Florida, generally the southern side is the worst side because that's where it's whipping in the moisture from the Gulf of Mexico because it spins counterclockwise. So fingers crossed that we will be on the less troublesome side. We do have forecasts keep changing, 6 to 10 inches of rain, and this is on top of rain that we've gotten in the last couple of days from just being in a tropical climate, I guess, subtropical, getting quite a bit of rain. So hopefully we're okay. With Ian a couple years ago, we got more than a foot of rain in 24 hours and no flooding by me at all. And thank you for all the people that have expressed concerns and offered a place to stay further north. I'm honored. I really do. That means a lot. Thank you to all those people that have done that. Our intention is to stay in the house. And if you didn't know, behind my house is an unused golf course, which is the best of both worlds because it's this big open green area with no golfers on it. But the reason I mention it is because about 200 feet behind my property line, the golf course goes down in elevation, and there's a low spot that's at least 50 feet below the slab for my house. So that's going to have to fill up. And the most it's ever had after Hurricane Ian was maybe 2 or 3 feet of water. It's probably never going to have 50 feet of water. Anything is possible, but our house is built on sand, a big slab poured on sand, and it absorbs a hell of a lot of water really quick. I have never actually seen any puddles anywhere in my vicinity, in my driveway, my yard, my neighbor's yards, the street. It all goes away. It either gets absorbed in the sand or gets put into the runoff water collection system. So I'm not worried about that. We don't have particularly big trees because it's a newer neighborhood built about 7 years ago. And a lot of them are appropriate plants and trees for this area so they can take quite a bit of wind. I would not be surprised if some trees come down in this one. Nothing big is close to our house or over our house. There's always the possibility that flying debris can break a window or two. Hopefully that doesn't happen. And I have my fancy schmancy Hyundai Ioniq 6 100% charged, and it can power two things. It has two outlets. One is the vehicle to load connector where you would normally plug in the car to charge it. And there's another outlet actually in the back seat where your feet would kick it. It's behind your heels. So with those two outlets, I can run a portable air conditioner that I bought a few months ago in the master bedroom so we can stay cool. The other connection will power the refrigerator, maybe a cooktop if we have to heat something. And I can hook up a computer or two, our internet connection, and charge phones. And of course, depending on exactly how much energy we draw, probably the biggest factor will be what is the high temperature after the hurricane. If the air conditioner doesn't need to run much, we might be able to go 5 to 6 days on the car battery, going from 100% down to 20%. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. Hopefully we don't lose power at all. And if we do, hopefully it's a few hours or a couple of days, but we can run air conditioning, the refrigerator, have lights, a fan or two, and internet connectivity, and the ability to charge our phones, all taken care of. Very little effort. A huge perk to having an electric car in an area that gets hurricane. And a few people have sent me stories or pointed out that electric cars don't do well in water. I already talked about that. I don't expect to have any water problems here. But just to be fair, almost every car has problems in water. It might even be worse in salt water, for all cars, but particularly for electric cars. And kind of my position, if you find yourself driving or in your car in salt water when you didn't plan on it, I guess, you've made some poor life choices. So if you're hearing this before the hurricane hits and you're on the west coast of Florida, get out, go somewhere else. Tidal surge there could be 12 to 15 feet. So you don't want to mess with that. You don't want to mess with the 120 plus mile per hour winds when they hit the coast. Hopefully, again, since I'm a good 90 miles to 100 miles inland from the path, from the first contact, it will get knocked down quite a bit. And the double extra bonus, perhaps being 40 miles north of the eye, is way better than being right under the eye or even south of the eye in this case. It's also predicted that this hurricane will still be or briefly recover to Category 1 once it gets to the Atlantic side of Florida. And that is also unusual. So yay, global warming, which of course our governor denies is a reality. We're going to go into a quick break, and then we'll have Polaris Plan 2024 Part 5, International Stock Index Funds and Managed Funds Allocation, and then a nice long discussion by listener request of John McNair. He is an attorney in the state of Texas and an expert in trusts, and we're going to talk all about trusts. So it can be a little heady, a little complicated, a little dense, but hopefully very informative. And maybe it will help spur the idea in your mind that if you have some money, that you might want to have a trust set up. Of course, you want to have an attorney in your state. I would also run your ideas by your tax professional and your financial advisor to make sure everyone agrees as best as possible what is the right path, what kind of trust you should have. Okay, that's enough. Ending the intro section, and we're going to go in the Polaris Plan Part 5 and then interview with John McNair on trusts.
Jesus says that he speaks in parables because the people, they just don't understand anything else. But the parables are often foggy and meaningless, and Jesus is snippy when even the disciples don't get them. He says to them, if you don't understand this parable, then how can you understand any parable? And are you incapable of understanding? I kept thinking, don't teach in parables then. It's not working. Even your staff doesn't understand them. Why don't you just say what you mean? Okay, so Jesus isn't so patient, and I think he picked a very ineffective lesson-giving technique, and he's angry most of the time, but that doesn't make him bad. It's just, wow, I really expected someone else. Some of the parables are not just foggy. To me, they're sort of offensive. Like in Luke, Jesus helps us understand God's relationship with humans by telling us a story about how God treats people the way people treat their slaves. They beat some more than they beat others. Okay, I know this was a different time and everything, and I really tried to keep that in mind as the Bible refers to slavery all over the place. And not only does it not say it's wrong, I mean, the Bible gives you advice about how you're supposed to keep your slaves and how slaves should behave obediently at all times to their masters. But I don't know, I guess I sort of thought the Son of God would say slavery was wrong. But no, Jesus does not say that. In fact, he uses slavery as an example of how God treats people. It was really hard to stay on Jesus' side when he started saying really aggressive, just hateful things. Like in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says that he is like a king who says, anyone who does not recognize me, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Or in John chapter 15, Jesus says, anyone who does not believe in me is like a withered branch that will be cast into the fire and burned. In Matthew, he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And in Luke, he says, and if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one. Then Jesus just starts acting downright crazy. Like in Matthew chapter 21, when this fig tree doesn't have a fig for Jesus to eat, he condemns the fig tree to death. That's right, Jesus condemns a fig tree to death. Not a parable, by the way, just Jesus pissed off that the fig tree didn't have a fig for him to eat when he wanted one. Not exactly the Prince of Peace who taught us to turn the other cheek. And then there's family. I have to say that for me, the most deeply upsetting thing about Jesus is his family values, which is amazing when you think how there's so many groups out there who say they base their family values on the Bible. I mean, he seems to have no real close ties to his parents. He puts his mother off cruelly over and over again. At the wedding feast, he says to her, woman, what have I to do with you? And once, while he was speaking to a crowd, Mary waited patiently off to the side to talk to him, and Jesus said to the disciples, send her away, because you are my family now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this exact same story, but Mark actually tells us why Mary was there to see Jesus. He says Mary came to see Jesus to restrain him, because the people were saying he's gone out of his mind. I kept thinking, yes, let's go get Jesus and get him some help.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. This is part 5 of 6 for the Polaris Plan 2024. If you want, you can go back to part 1. That's show number 500, and then listen to those 4 episodes. This will help you understand part 5. Part 5 is about international stock allocation. So we start with your retirement plan. We figure some things out. We discussed that in the previous parts. We figure out how much of your money should be in the cushion, and that's determined by how many dollars you might need out of the portfolio on an annual basis and how aggressive or conservative you want to be with your retirement portfolio. Different people have different levels of volatility, anxiety that they want to have. Then we talked about, so we had the bonds versus stocks, and then we're talking about how much should be international in stocks versus domestic. And now I'm getting into the little details of what you should invest in with your international allocation. Again, quick reminder, this is just a presentation of ideas and guidelines that might be helpful to you. It's not necessarily in your best interest to follow this exact plan. You should have your own plan, which could be similar to this, but hopefully just to get you to understand having a plan is better than having not a plan, I guess. Which reminds me, I just got an email from a show listener that was very nice that they had told me that for several years they were doing individual stock picking and kept underperforming index funds, which is what we would expect. The probabilities are that if you're stock picking or using a managed fund, it's going to underperform the indexes, and they're in the process of switching everything over to just index funds. It's less work, it's less effort, it's less stress, lower expenses, hopefully lower taxes if you're in a taxable account. And at the end of the day, you make more money with less effort and less volatility. So let's jump in. I use 6 different funds for the international stock exposure. This is very similar to how I do it with the U.S. stock market, but not as tight, not as clean, just because I don't have the same funds to choose from internationally. So the first 2, of course, are international growth and value. These are the funds that are the closest to the large cap growth and value index funds for the U.S. domestic. I almost forgot. Just to make double sure I'm clear, this is not personal investment advice for anybody, and it is meant for listeners in the United States. If you're in a different country, these ideas might help, but check and understand your system far better than I do, because I don't understand your country's investments. I just understand the United States. Anyway, we have large cap growth and value, Pacific Index, European Index, International Small Cap Index, and International Emerging Markets Index. And emerging markets is all the smaller countries around the world that are trying to grow their economy and become a more modern, I don't know what to say other than that that's the emerging markets, because I don't want to say anything insulting. They're wonderful people. They're doing their best. They just haven't got to the economic level that some other countries have achieved, and hopefully they will. In large cap growth, if you have at least 50,000 to put into that position, the fund I like is VWILX. No surprise, these are all Vanguard funds. If you don't have 50,000, pretty much the same fund with a teeny bit higher expense ratio because you're putting less money in is VWIGX. And I'm currently using that around 18% of the international position. The next thing, which is 22% of international position, is the large cap value fund. I'm only aware of one of them, and that's VTRIX. If there's a different one, cool, use it. VTRIX. For Pacific, I am using VPADX. And for Europe, I'm using VEUSX. The International Small Cap Fund is VFSAX. And the Emerging Markets Fund is VEMAX. There might be an alternate or a variant if you have larger amounts or need to invest smaller amounts. I think all of these probably have an ETF version if you want to use an ETF. I generally try to avoid ETFs because they're so easy to trade that it gives an extra temptation to people to trade them. I don't want you trading. I want you adding, buying, and holding possibly once a year, rebalancing possibly twice a year if there's something dramatic that happened. But generally, you have a plan. Leave it the fuck alone. Just tweak every once in a while. So the allocation percentages for all of those, since I now have given all of the symbols, large cap growth 18%, large cap value 22%. The Pacific and European index, each of those are 10% of the international, and the last 2, international small and emerging markets, are 20% of those. And hopefully that all adds up to 100%. So you have 18, 22, Pacific and Europe at 10, international small cap and emerging markets at 20% each. So get something close to that. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but that will have exposure. And as an example, in the last 12 months ending September 30th of 2024, just the recent numbers, not any more significant than the other numbers, but just something to look at. The International Growth Fund, VWILX, in the last 12 months ending September 30th is up 29%. Now, I've had this discussion for a while. International has lagged, and 29% still technically lagging the S&P 500, but it's a hell of a number. Hell of a number. The amazing thing is that fund, the International Growth, has an average return of minus 3.65 over the last 3 years. And that includes the last calendar year, which I just gave you about 29%. So it has done terribly, and now it's not doing terribly. The International Value Fund is up 21.6. So we have 29 versus 21.6. So this is what causes the potential for rebalancing if it's a big enough of a difference. If it only takes $1 or $2 or $3,000 to rebalance, you might not want to. If you're off by 1% or 2%, you might not want to. You don't want to create tax consequences and trading expenses if you don't need to. But if you're in the position of adding money, I'd be more inclined to add it to the value position in international versus the growth position, because it's lagging. It's not performing as well as the other parts of international. And this all ties into the well-used phrases that I adore, is the clarity and granularity. So you can see exactly how much you have in international growth versus international value. And you can see that. So you have that clarity, and you have the ability to sell from one position and rebalance into another one, or add money to the one that is lagging. Or if you're in retirement and you need cash to fill up your cash position, you sell from the one that's done the best, or the ones that have done the best. So that creates a system where you're regularly buying low and selling high. We all know that that's common sense with stock investing. You want to buy low and sell high. But how does one do that? And how does one avoid the emotional traps? It's by doing something like this. You have the numbers, you have the percentages, you have a target, you have a plan. You stick to the plan. If your actual numbers diverge from the plan in a large enough of amount for you to do a rebalance once a year, maybe twice for a large account, then you just rebalance back to what your plan is. See, there's not this whole thing about, oh my God, is this company doing well? This company just fell 10 or 20%. And in my opinion, if your portfolio plan is sufficiently robust enough, you shouldn't worry about whether bonds are down or stocks are down or how much they're up or down. It's just a system. You just do the system. And I'm trying to remove emotion from the thought process of your investing. Anywho, those are the positions for international. I hope this helps you create your own plan or follow the Polaris Plan 2024. Wrapping up this segment, and we'll continue with more of the show.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
I've always been an atheist. I simply, as time went on, I became more interested in American intellectual history, and I felt that the secular side of our history was very much underrepresented in readable, popular history books. So that's how I got into it. I am not an atheist propagandist in that I'm not interested in converting people to atheism. What I'm interested in is talking about what the secular side of our history has meant to the development of the United States.
And what has the secular side of the development of our history meant for the development of the United States?
Well, it's something that's not talked about much because we've got all these people going blah, blah, blah about how this was founded as a Christian nation. But it wasn't founded as a Christian nation, although we were overwhelmingly a majority Christian people at the time the Constitution was written. But what did the founders do in the Constitution? They made a break with all previous documents, including the state constitutions at the time after the revolution, and they didn't mention God. They didn't say that governmental power flows from God. They said, we the people. The word God does not appear in the Constitution at all, which always astonishes my college audiences when I tell them that, which tells you how badly American history is taught. In fact, what's generally taught about the origins of the United States is everybody who came here for religious liberty, which is true. But initially, before we became the United States and were colonial America, the people who came here for religious liberty came here for religious liberty for themselves, not for anybody else. So the first thing the Puritans did in Massachusetts was try to get rid of everybody who didn't agree with them. However, the founders had a very different view, which is because there were already people of so many different faiths here, we needed to have no state faith. So they just left it out altogether of the Constitution. The First Amendment was made specifically to protect religion from government. The Constitution itself, which leaves God out, was meant to protect government from religion. The two go together.
Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. All right, everybody, welcome to the show. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. And with me today, I have John McNair. He is an attorney in Texas, and we're going to talk about trusts. And John, before I get too far into this, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. I want to make sure my listeners understand this correctly. If they want a trust or if they have legal questions, they probably should consult somebody in their state. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every state has different rules about their trust, their related estate planning documents. It is very state-oriented, and most attorneys are not entitled to practice outside their particular state. I'm
Right.
only licensed in Texas. I'm not licensed in any other state. So they truly need to have an expert in estate planning and elder law in their particular state.
Just popped into my head, how long after my death, if I have a trust, how long can I control from the grave is the phrase I use. I don't know if that's the right thing to say. How long is that allowed in Texas?
So that's an interesting question.
Thank you.
We were like most states from English law for most of my career, and we had something called the rule against perpetuities.
Yeah.
And the rule against perpetuities says that a trust can last for lives in being plus 21 years. So you've talked, as we have waited to start this, about your children. I'm assuming they're adults since they were talking to you as if they were adults.
Yes.
In your conversation. And if they have children, under the rules against perpetuities, you could keep it open for their lives and the lives of your grandchildren that are alive when you die. And then at the end, then it goes away. A few years ago, Texas followed a trend of a lot of states where they are either modifying or eliminating the rule against perpetuities. And in Texas, they modified it. You can't make a trust last forever in Texas. You can only make it last for 300 years. And there is a question in Texas whether that's constitutional under the Texas Constitution.
Yeah.
Most of my clients don't have enough wealth that they want to keep it around for 300 years.
Yeah. My wife and I, just one of the inspirations for doing this now, my wife and I were just meeting with an attorney in Florida where I live. And her perspective was pretty much in the state of Florida, it's forever. Whatever kind of rules we want to put on it, we're not doing that. But
yeah, that's one of those states that has eliminated the rule against perpetuities, I'm assuming, based on that conversation.
Yeah, it's so this is just one of hundreds of little details that can come up while you want to talk to somebody in your state. As usual.
And may I point out
Yes.
the conundrum that I've always worried about if
What's
you
that?
decided to do something like that?
Yeah.
Let's assume that you felt like you had a large enough amount of wealth to do that. So how would you structure that trust for multiple generations going down the line? Would it be what we call a pot trust? Would it be one trust for all of those generations? And let's assume that you could find a trustee for that, like a corporate trustee.
Right.
They're the kind that would take those. Are they going to be happy? I'm not talking about the corporate trustee. I'm talking about your beneficiaries down the line,
Yeah.
knowing that every time their cousin gets some money, that's money out of their pocket. They're not getting that. And why is that person getting it? Why am I not getting it? And so you're creating the potential for conflict among your generations.
Yeah, because
Okay, well, what's the other alternative? They talk about cascading trusts where every individual beneficiary gets their own trust.
right.
But if you had a $10 million trust, down the road, would each person have such a small trust as it got to great, great, great grandchildren? Would it be worth the effort to keep that trust in place?
And I don't know about in Texas, but here in Florida or Illinois, a local bank, for example, that has a trust department, they will often want something like a flat annual $5,000 to $10,000 a year, and then on top of that, they're going to want something to manage the investments. So
I
it
haven't
can.
seen too many that have a dollar figure. Most of them want a percentage of
Yeah.
the assets under management on an annual basis.
Yep.
And I think it's usually 1%, give or take some basis points.
Yeah, I've seen as low as 1%. I've seen higher, 1.5. But I've also
The
seen where
smaller
there's
the trust, I think the
Yeah.
higher there could be.
well, and that's where they'll have the floor where they'll say it's 1%, but a minimum of $5,000. So if your trust gets to be 100,000, they're sucking out $5,000 a year, minimum for them to do it. So it can consume it. So you might want to have some language that says if it gets to a certain point, it liquidates.
I do that.
Yeah.
I have that specific language in my trust, and I usually pick 100,000.
That's a good number. Before we get into too many more fun details, we're learning all the time. So this is the point of this. I want to go over the main factor that divides trusts into two different categories, and I think the best way to do that is revocable versus irrevocable. Can you walk me through what those words mean?
Right. Typically, a revocable trust is one you established for yourself. You create a trust in which you are the trustee, you are the beneficiary, and you can revoke it, amend it, or alter it at any time. As a result, it is not intended to be there are some states where this is not true, but in most states, this is a trust that is not creditor protected. It is not intended to be a creditor protection device. It doesn't, in and of itself, a revocable trust is not an estate tax planning tool.
Yeah.
You embed estate tax planning tools within a revocable trust. But I use revocable trust for two primary reasons. I believe it is a superior way to manage your assets for you if you became incapacitated, as opposed to relying solely on a power of attorney. I have seen many financial institutions that have given my clients' agents difficulties when they tried to show up with a power of attorney. So I try to avoid that. It does avoid probate. Texas doesn't have a terrible probate system, but it depends on your state whether your probate system is difficult or not.
Right.
So those are the two primary reasons for a revocable trust. An irrevocable trust is, by definition, not revocable, amendable, or changeable. And it is typically a gift trust. You're either creating an irrevocable trust for somebody else during your lifetime, or the discussion we just had, an irrevocable trust for somebody else after you die. Your children each one of your children gets a portion of the vast Ferguson empire in trust, and they become their own trustee of an irrevocable trust. They get to use it for their own health support and maintenance. And that trust can protect that asset from their creditors and their divorces because they didn't create it. Somebody else did.
Right.
You, in my scenario, and as a result, you can put in that trust something called a spendthrift clause. Audience shouldn't care how that trust is creditor protected. Just the point is it's creditor protected because you created it for somebody else, not that person creating it for themselves.
Now, could I create a revocable trust that I control? It's mine, not necessarily separate from creditors or whatever. But when my wife and I pass away, it has instructions to create 2 irrevocable trusts, one
Exactly.
for each
Yes,
one of my children, so that if at some point in the future they marry a moron and then get divorced and that moron wants to take half of it, they can't have it.
Exactly. That is exactly the model we use. That's what happens.
Now, also in a irrevocable trust, if I did that while I'm alive, let's say I had $1 million and I put $1 million in an irrevocable trust, and then I get sued for $1 million, is that $1 million now protected and it's safe from creditors?
You made a gift of $1 million into an irrevocable trust for your children in your scenario?
Well, I'm just saying irrevocable trust that while I'm alive, I can
You can't create a trust, an irrevocable trust for yourself that will protect you from your creditors outside of a few jurisdictions. South Dakota, I think, does it. Alaska was the pioneer state, maybe Delaware.
Yeah.
I don't delve into that very often. But if you make a gift, let's just use a standard issue state where they don't have those types of self-settled irrevocable trusts that are creditor protected. You would be making a gift into an irrevocable trust for the benefit of somebody else, presumably your children.
Right.
And it will be protected from your creditors if you have not triggered a problem with the Fraudulent Transfer Act. Every state has implemented some kind of Fraudulent Transfer Act where they basically say if the creditor can prove that you transferred that asset in anticipation of avoiding your known debts or potential debts, then the courts would have the ability to reach out and pull that asset back out of the trust and give it to your creditors.
And
it comes up where you know that you've been in a car wreck and you've been sued, and you make a gift into a trust. You haven't had a judgment against you at that point, but you knew there was a potential for those creditors to come after you and get a judgment later. So that would probably be a transfer and fraud of creditors.
How about in relationship to Medicare, Medicaid? You know, you're 64 years old and you're like, wow, I want the most I can get from Medicare, Medicaid, or if I go in a nursing home, I don't want to have to pay for it because I don't have any money. So I put it in a trust. Is that going to play?
So how that works is it's Medicaid, by the way, that pays for long-term care. And a gift in Medicaid land is something that creates a penalty, a period of time in which you are not eligible for Medicaid.
And that's the look-back period?
Well, let's divide things up. Before we get to the look-back period, there's just a penalized gift, and each state creates their own penalty divisor. Like in Texas, our penalty divisor ends up being roughly this year, and it changes every year based on inflation, but roughly just below $7,400 per month. So if you gave $100,000 into a trust for your children and an irrevocable trust, and then immediately applied, then you divide $7,400 into that 100,000. I don't know how many. It'd be more than 12 months. But that many months you would not be eligible for Medicaid. Now, let's talk about the look-back period. The look-back period is the period in which you have to report prior gifts on your application for Medicaid, and those gifts if you have to report them, we'll create that penalty period. And the penalty starts from when you apply, not from when the clock is ticking, not from when you made the gift, but when you apply. And the 5-year look back period is the reporting period. You don't have to report gifts that you made more than 5 years ago. So if somebody were going to implement a plan in which they made a gift into an irrevocable trust, they would be betting that their health is going to hang on for the next 5 years, and they don't need that money. They've got other sources. They have a high enough monthly income to cover care if they needed it during that 5-year period. But after 5 years, they wouldn't have to report the gift into the trust, and those assets would no longer be countable resources. If you're a single individual, you can't have more than $2,000 of countable resources. There are much more generous rules if you're a married couple.
Yeah.
The spousal impoverishment rules, which would take us hours to explain, so I'm not going to do that right now. But just be aware that a married couple might not need to do that as much as a single person might.
Sure. Now, what kind of total assets do you think someone should consider getting a trust? I mean, if someone's got $10,000, probably not necessary. 5 million, yes, but where's that line?
So I feel like it's a combination of what type of assets you have and numbers. Because if you have real estate, you should probably consider a trust.
Yeah.
Your residence is going to be several $100,000, almost assuredly. If you don't have one and the only asset you have is an IRA, well, A, you can't put an IRA in a trust, and B, it's not going to go through probate anyway if you have proper beneficiary designation. So you might not need that. But if you had a couple of $100,000 of cash and a trust and a house, a revocable trust would be an appropriate thing to consider.
It popped into my head another question here. What if you have, let's say, $1 million IRA and you have 2 kids? So on your death, they each get 500, assuming you put them both as primary 50-50 beneficiaries, equal split. But instead of going to the kids, that goes to the revocable trust, which then becomes irrevocable on your death. And that would allow you to control from the grave and spoon feed out the money so they don't get it. But then it also probably fucks up tax consequences.
So the way that works is this. A few years ago, I'm sure you're aware of this, Congress changed the rules. And if you're not a spouse, you basically have to pull everything out of an inherited IRA over the course of 10 years from the date of death of the decedent.
Yes.
And so by the anniversary date of the 10th year, it's all got to be out of there. I recommend to my clients these days that create a plan like we've talked about. You have your own revocable living trust, and when Phil Ferguson and his wife pass, it goes to their 2 kids. Those 2 kids then have irrevocable trusts that are created for them, and Phil Ferguson, instead of naming his kids individually as beneficiaries or his living trust, that's not a good beneficiary either for these tax rules.
Okay.
He named specifically John Doe Ferguson, Descendant Trust, Mary Jane Ferguson, Descendant Trust, as the 2 beneficiaries. And then 2 inherited IRAs will be created, and those 2 IRAs will start sending the money down over the course of 10 years. And by the end of the 10 years, the inherited IRAs will go away because there's nothing left. And although you've had to pay income taxes, it's gone down the line. There's no alternative. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
But you've captured the money in a creditor protected and a moron son or daughter-in-law proof trust.
Now, would the taxes be due year one? Or is that
due every time there are required minimum distributions as they are pulled out of the tax-free environment of the IRA? And remember, 1/10 of the IRA has to be pulled out. The IRS put in place some regulations last year.
Yeah, about the RMDs.
It could have said that you don't have to pull anything out until the 10th anniversary, but that's not what they said. They said you have to use your actuarial life as a beneficiary. Your son and your daughter have to each use their own life over that 10-year period, and then whatever's left over in year 10 has to go out. But it's all going to the trust, and as it's going to the trust, it's subject to income tax.
So
whether it's taxed to the trust or to your son or daughter depends on what they do with the money once it gets in the trust. If they leave it there the entire year, it will be taxed to the trust. If they pull it out and put it in their own pocket and spend it so it's not available to the moron or to the creditors, then it will be taxed to them.
And of course, a trust, in this case, the scenario, the irrevocable trust, whatever taxes it owes from the IRA will be at a very compressed structure. So anything over like $12,000 or $13,000 of gains will be 37% tax.
That's right. That's why I talked about possibly deciding to pull those out. But you give the discretion to the child. I mean, they might decide we're investing in other things inside the trust to offset that income tax liability, if indeed there are such things you can invest in. That's your area of expertise.
Right.
But maybe you offset and you don't have so much taxable income, and you're doing strategies to deal with that, or you just pull it out and spend it.
Yeah. So who own, so I have $1 million and I split it up upon my death, and assuming my wife dies with me at the same time, and I got 2 kids. So $1 million, $500 goes to the boy, $500 goes to the girl. Is it liquidated that year and the taxes are paid? Or you're thinking it can,
an IRA?
Yeah, an IRA that the trust can drag it out over 10 years.
There's inherited IRAs that are sitting there. You don't want to liquidate it, then you'd subject
Right. But who owns the inherited IRA?
The trustee has control.
The trustee, but the trust owns it?
The trust owns it.
Okay.
Subject to the control of the trustee, your son and your daughter.
Because I was thinking if you did that, it would have to be liquidated right away.
No.
But you're thinking the trust could follow.
It has to be liquidated based on the IRS rules.
Right. And are the IRS rules, and this is a tax question, so may not be your expertise. What's the lifespan of a trust then? Or is it based on the lifespan of the recipient, the beneficiary of the trust?
The 10 years is based on the lifespan of the. So first off, you have to create a trust where the IRS can see through the trust and figure out who the measuring life is.
Okay.
And that's the job of the attorney, to draft it in such a way that it is an appropriate accumulation trust as opposed to a conduit trust. There are trusts that can be drafted. A conduit trust says every time an IRA distribution is put in this trust, it must go out to the beneficiary.
Right.
I don't like that because I want to give them discretion. Again, as you pointed out, it may be an income tax negative to leave it in the trust, but I want to give that trustee child the discretion to figure out, is there a way to keep it in there? Because every dollar kept in the trust is creditor protected and divorce protected.
Yeah.
But if we draft the trust right, they are the measuring life. The son and the daughter are the measuring life, and it comes out over 10 years because the IRS has been able to determine there is a primary beneficiary. But the trust lasts forever. Any dollars that you haven't distributed to the child stay there as long as you 300 years if you want.
So you could theoretically, while the IRA has to be liquidated by the trust and is subject to trust taxes based on the IRS rules, the trust would have to liquidate and pull money out of the IRA, but it wouldn't necessarily have to dispense all of the funds For example, you could put a thing in there saying the beneficiary only gets 5% of the portfolio every year for 20 years.
You could do that.
Yeah. And
I have done that in cases where we have I've done that a lot with marital trust, where we have a blended family and we have a second spouse and children from the prior marriage. And the children from the prior marriage are the remainder beneficiaries. I've used that payout scheme. It's called a private unit trust in estate planning jargon. You establish it typically as 5% of the value of the assets calculated annually has to go out to that primary beneficiary. And in this case, with a marital trust, that's perfect, because then you're not fighting between the stepmom or stepdad and the children.
right.
In a trust for your own children, you typically, I have done that once or twice where the guy it's always a guy, didn't trust his children to be prudent with spending it.
Yeah.
But usually it's a HIM standards, health, education, maintenance, and support. The beneficiary can distribute for health, education, maintenance, and support.
You mean the trustee can distribute to the
your child can distribute to themselves and to their own children for their own health, education, maintenance, and support, and the health, education, maintenance, and support of their particular children.
And I think
so that gives them the discretion whether to pull it out in the year that the IRA distribution is received or not.
Yeah. I think the nice thing that we've probably confused enough listeners with the beautiful nuance of all this, that they need to hire a fucking attorney if they want to do this.
It's probably a good idea, yes.
And I have another question, but before we do that, I don't want to forget, if you're in Texas, how can people reach you, John?
So my phone number is 469-210-8371. And my email is jmcnair@mcnair-dallaslaw.com. Or they can go to my website, which is mcnair-dallaslaw.com.
Excellent. And of course, if you're not in Texas, maybe you could contact John, see if he knows somebody not in Texas. But you do need to hire an attorney in your state. It's very important. The rules vary by state. The other thing that I had in my mind was, what about, I think it's a charitable remainder trust, where I want to keep living off the money, but when I die, the money goes into a charity. How does that work?
So I don't see many people setting up charitable remainder trust to start when they die.
Okay.
Most people do that while they're alive. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, there's an IRS rule, or maybe a statute, a congressional statute, that says and I know this is a difficult concept, but if actually looking at the term that you set for that trust, the remainder going to beneficiaries other than, or the charity,
right?
You've got lifetime non-charity beneficiaries. If the value of the interest going to the charity is less than 10% calculated at the point that trust is established, it doesn't meet the test to be a charitable remainder trust and get the tax benefits.
Because there's nothing left. I mean, that kind of makes sense.
So you can't predict when you die what will be the actuarial remainder interest going to that charity, because you don't know how old your children will be at that point.
Yeah.
So, and the second reason is the primary reason people set up charitable remainder trust, I think, is because in essence, it's an income tax play to change what would be a large capital gain event into something that looks a lot like a sale for a promissory note, where you get taxed on that gain and over a longer period of time. Because if you sell a closely held business and you're selling stock of your business, and you started the business with nothing and now it's worth $20 million, there could be a lot of gain in that, and it'll be all taxed to you this year. If you are able to gift that to a charitable remainder trust prior to selling it, and so the trust is selling it, not you, then the charitable remainder trust rules are that you, as the primary beneficiary while you're getting it, let's say it's you can do it for up to 20 years or life. Most people don't do life. Over the course of that 20 years, part of that payment to you is being taxed as a capital gain. And so you're stretching out your gain. You're not getting it all taxed. You're deferring capital gain over the course of the life of that trust. That's why most people do that. Now, there's a lot of complicating reason why that doesn't work. Right. A lot of times, the buyer is not real thrilled with buying from a charitable remainder trust. Most people don't bother to think about it and talk to their attorney until after a letter of intent has already been signed by the buyer, and it's too late at that point for the IRS. So it doesn't happen very often, but that's the primary reason people create charitable remainder trusts, I think.
Very good. Is there anything we haven't covered that you want to make sure we get in on this little chat?
I just would say don't forget all of your ancillary documents related to your estate plan beyond just the revocable trust. As we've talked about, you may very well, almost always, still need financial powers of attorney because, again, most people have retirement accounts that can't be placed in a revocable trust. Make sure you have medical powers of attorney so somebody can manage your health for you if you can't do that for yourself. Make sure you have a HIPAA release so that your medical agent has access to your medical records. Most people want to put in place an advance directive so that if they're put on life support systems and they're in a fatal condition and they have no chance of recovery, if they don't want to be maintained in that state, then they can say to their family and their doctors, take me off and keep me comfortable. Excuse me. And those kind of related documents.
Right.
Talk to your estate planning attorney about making sure you have all of those, not just the trust.
Excellent. Well, John McNair, thank you for educating and confusing us all at the same time. Like I said, the important thing is, we just start thinking about these ideas, processing these thoughts, and if you think it's the right thing for you, make sure you get an attorney in your state. That's really important. And I would go further, and just like you were talking about, make sure you consult with a tax professional and make sure you consult with your financial advisor to make sure it all kind of works together, because you don't want to think you're doing something clever that ends up screwing you. So,
exactly right.
John,
when I do estate planning, I think it's a team effort.
Yeah.
I would like them to have their CPA and their financial advisor as part of the planning process.
It's a funny thing because I know that there are, especially the bigger brand name companies, where they'll have a CPA and an attorney and an advisor all on board. I get a little scared about that they might always be thinking about how it benefits them, the company that they work for.
Right.
So that's why I really like someone like you, independent attorney, an independent tax person, independent advisor that can share emails back and forth and kind of all sort of agree that this is an okay thing for you, the end customer.
Right.
John, thank you so much for your time and joining me here on The Phil Ferguson Show.
Thank you.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Why do we have religion in the first place? Why are we having this discussion? Because we are pattern-seeking mammals. It's part of our evolution. We look for patterns. We're designed to look for them. And if we can't find a good explanation, we'll come up with a bad one, rather than none at all. Most people would rather have a conspiracy theory than no theory. It's very observable that. There's a lot of junk science around before good science arrives. Before we have astronomy, we have astrology. Before we have chemistry, we have alchemy. All of these things are derivatives of religion, because in a very sinister verse of the Bible that used to upset me when I was being forced to listen to it as a little boy, it says, "Seek and ye shall find." Yes, that's exactly right. Seek and you will find. Seek for an explanation of volcanic eruptions when you're living in a primitive society, and you will think they're probably a visitation from an angry deity. And if you're told you can postpone the next eruption by throwing a few live babies into the lava down the crater, that's what you'll do. Religion has just started. Religion has just begun.
I am so delighted you're still here. This, of course, is Phil Ferguson, and you're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. When our recent trip, I ran into some people that recognized me by my voice or by my name or something, and it was cute, endearing, and they would say, wait, you're the Phil Ferguson? Because of the title of the show. You're always welcome to come up and say hi to me. The next thing, of course, is CSI-Con in Las Vegas, put on by the Center for Inquiry. And on the 24th of October, just a couple of weeks from now, we will have a Friends of the Show meeting on Thursday, October 24th, starting at 3 o'clock, from 3 to 5 at the Fuel Bar. This is in Las Vegas. The Grand Bazaar shops right in front of the Horseshoe Casino where the conference is being held. You do not have to be going to the conference. I'm assuming most people will, but if you're in the area and you want to drive and figure out how the fuck to park downtown, I guess not downtown, in that part of Vegas by the Horseshoe Casino, you are welcome to join the Friends of the Show meet and greet, I guess, at the Fuel Bar from 3 to 5, and then we go to Wahlburger from 5 to 7. Just to be clear, you're paying for your own food and drinks. I'm not paying for everybody. You're paying your own way, and you can come late, you can leave early. When we go over to Wahlburger, my expectation is we'll probably split up into small groups so they can seat us easily, because I don't know how many people are coming. It might be 4. It might be 3 people join me. That'd be great. It might be 40. And Fuel Bar, it's not a big deal because you could just stand inside, stand outside. You can have open drinks outside of the door of the Fuel Bar. But when we go to Wahlburger, I don't want to impose on the staff by saying we have 24 people, find us a table. So we'll break up into probably small groups of 3 or 4, maybe big groups of 5 or 6. We'll see how that goes. We'll play that by ear. But that's coming up in Las Vegas. Let's see. What else do I have? Oh, I did want to do a quick moment, just a thought about volatility and changing performance. And generally, if you listen to the show, you'll know that I'll either do, well, if I'm looking back at time, when I do numbers, performance numbers, it's basically by calendar year when I can. Sometimes when I pull information from Morningstar, it might have a year number based on whenever I pulled it or populated it. And I might even talk about year-to-date data for this year. The reason I stick to calendar years in the past is because I just want it to be as facts. I want to not have the temptation to pick a different starting date and a different ending date to get a different result. So I'm trying to remove that bias. And I normally don't talk about shorter term returns, but I felt like I needed to just briefly here as an example of how having different, say, particularly stock funds, also different bond funds, but they react to different things, not the point of this segment or this mini segment or this conversation. But stock funds, so the example is while large cap growth has done fantastically, except for calendar year 2022, in the last year, it's done great. The year to date has done great. But I'm going to look at a shorter time period, 3 months, just to illustrate one of the concepts. So the Large Cap Growth Fund, VIGAX, as pulled up on Morningstar.com, currently the historical 3-month performance is minus 2%. Not bad. Big deal, right? But if I look at International Growth Fund in the last 3 months, it's up 5%. And the International Value Fund is up 6%. So you have a 7 and 8 point difference in just 3 months. And international has been a laggard for quite some time, but in the last 3 months, it's kicked ass. Will it happen for another 3 months? Who knows? Will it happen for the next year or 2 or 3? Who knows? But if you had everything in the large cap growth in the last 3 months, you've lost money. If you had it in large cap growth and other parts of the U.S. segment and other parts of international, you've done quite well during the last 3 months. Things change, and often they'll change before you have the ability to adapt to that change. So you have to be in position before it happens, and that can lead to underperformance for a period of time, maybe years. But then when the winds change and something else does better, you're already there. And so you get that score. The resulting, of course, is one hopes better performance, but it is also very likely to have less volatility because you didn't make as much on the upside. You didn't lose as much on the downside with the large cap growth fund, given the last few months as an example. So anyway, that's it. I'm going to return to hurricane prep, and hopefully everything is wonderful. And in a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, whatever, whenever I get the next show out, everything will be fine. And I'll give you an update, of course, on how we're doing. You can follow on social media, Facebook, Threads. I'm on Threads trying to get more connections there. So if you're on Threads and you haven't friended me, followed me, what is it? Follow, I think. Go look for me on Threads. And I'm going to wrap up the show. And I do hope to see you in person soon. Until then, ciao.